The tension within the territory led to the Civil War in 1856. Civil War in the small c, small w sense, because the real Civil War came 5 years later. The Free State men fortified their capital, Lawrence, and it was wrecked by the pro-slavery forces. In retaliation, now they felt they could do this because it was a foreign capital. What the hell are they doing? We've got recognition. In retaliation, John Brown led a small band in an attack on a settlement near Potawatomi Creek where 5 pro-slavery men were murdered. Guerrilla warfare continued despite the presence of United States troops in the territory. Despite the presence of United States troops in the territory. Who chose the Civil War? The American people or some freaking government authority? Who chose the Civil War? The government was in charge of it. The government executed it. But who chose it? Who wanted it? Who paid for it? Who supported it? Who supported, who came up with all of the thoughts for the Civil War? Who came up with all of the attitude that turned into what became the Civil War? The people. Who chose the Civil War? The people. Who wanted it? The people. Who paid for it? The people. Whose fault is it? The people's. Ultimately, the people who had slaves. You can't blame it on the people who wanted to do away with slavery. Would you do that? Would you blame it on the people who wanted to do away with slavery? In Bleeding, Kansas, 5 years before the Civil War started, America said to themselves, let's fight. Now I apologize to go with such a cliche, but Time Life books. Brother Against Brother, the Time Life books, History of the Civil War. And we're going to take some information from here. Now we're going to start with the foreword by James M. McPherson. James McPherson. And we're going to skip down a couple paragraphs in the foreword, and we're starting in the third paragraph in the foreword. Americans were preoccupied by the question of states' rights and national survival during the first 3 generations of the Republic's existence. Some Americans, we've already seen that this is when the states viewed themselves as part of a union rather than as part of a nation. Some Americans advocated the rights of state secession and periodically threatened to invoke it. In 1860 through 61, 11 states did invoke it. If allowed to stand, this action would have constituted a precedent that meant the end of the United States. It would have been from then on the voluntary states. The next time a disaffected minority lost a presidential election, there might well be another secession until the American Republic collapsed into numerous petty, squabbling states. Quote, "We must settle this question now," said Abraham Lincoln in 1861. "Whether in free government, the minority have the right to break up the government whenever they choose." End quote. Is that right? So we're in a free country now. And this group over here decides, we're going to break the government. We don't like it. Is that right? We can just allow people to break the government when they don't like it? Union triumph in 1865 settled it. No state or region has tried to secede from the United States since. Now, a quote from Lincoln, "The monstrous injustice of slavery deprives our Republican example of its just influence in the world." Is he right? Is he right? Everyone who points at America, the cities are paved in gold in America. They have black people locked in pens and they whip them. It's terrible, very inconsistent. You can't be proud of it. America's been a place to be proud of ever since the Civil War. Before that, you gotta cringe a bit. So he says we would be a better beacon for the world if we didn't have slaves. He says it's terrible for us to be one of the few last remaining people with slaves. It's terrible. It enables the enemies of free institutions with plausibility to taunt us as hypocrites, right? So in other words, we're taking crap from thugs because we got slaves here. That's the end of the quote from Lincoln there. With the abolition of slavery by the Civil War, that particular hypocrisy plagued the United States no more. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, the Civil War Amendments, achieved on paper the most sudden and radical social transformation in American history. Indeed, in the history of any nation. I'll bet you could write a couple books on that. You could write a couple books on how the transformation that we saw in the United States of America to go from an economy in which 20 or 30% of the population is based on slavery, a slave economy. I mean, it's just amazing change. Continuing the quote, in the space of 5 years, 4 million slaves were emancipated and granted equal citizenship rights with their former masters, at a cost of 620,000 soldiers' lives and the destruction of the social organization and economic infrastructure of half the country. Well, most of the infrastructure was in the north, but, well, let's say half the country, and it's hyperbole, what the hell. The free labor capitalism of the North prevailed over the slave labor plantation agriculture of the South. I think we might hit the statistics sooner or later in one of our bits here. 97% of firearms were produced in the northern states at the beginning of the war. It's almost as ludicrous as when the American Revolution declared independence from Britain, and they couldn't even produce lead. However, one does pause and take notice of the fact that the people who rebelled in the Civil War lost. Now we're going to go to page 20, The Roots of Conflict. This is, okay, so at the top of the page here, to start the chapter, as people do, they have a little bit from the New Orleans Daily Crescent, December 17th, 1860. The New Orleans. You know where that's at, New Orleans. December 17th, 1860, right? Quote, the Southern people, driven to the wall, have no remedy but that of political independence. Forbearance has not only ceased to be a virtue, but has become absolute cowardice. So in other words, they were saying it's done. If you don't support war and secession at this point, you're a coward. That was the attitude in the South. To revisit our theme, I don't think we can blame this attitude on Lincoln. I don't think Lincoln got it. I don't think he has to take credit for the war. We start the chapter here, and the quote begins with a guy, Ruffin, R-U-F-F-I-N. This guy who went to a meeting hall for Southern people who wanted to secede. A meeting hall during the crisis. So he goes into this meeting hall, and he's in Charleston, South Carolina, and, quote, he met scores of old friends and fellow fire-eaters who had been leaders in the fight to break up the Union. They watched as David F. Jameson, a gentleman scholar who lived graciously on the proceeds of a 2,000-acre 70-slave plantation, called the convention to order using a gavel incised with the word secession. Momentous issues remained to be settled, including a new law code, customs regulations, and negotiations with the government known as the United States over transforming federal property to the new Republic of South Carolina. So this is all the business they decided to do. They seceded now, and let's go ahead and take care of business. All the federal land that used to belong to the federal government of the United States, we'll take care of that, distribute that, have a policy. So they had an enormous economic interest. Who is not impugning the economic interests of the people who seceded? I mean, people are impugning Abraham Lincoln's interests. For God's sakes, who is not impugning the interests of Jefferson Davis? He was supporting the right to secede so that he could own slaves. This is laughable. Now it talks about how at 1:15, 169 delegates voted to adopt the Ordinance of Secession. That evening, the new nation's founding fathers reconvened for the signing ceremony, a 2-hour affair that ended with the Jameson holding up the completed document. Quote, I proclaim the state of South Carolina an independent commonwealth, he said. An enormous roar of approval shook the hall. Who chose the Civil War? Ladies and gentlemen, who chose the Civil War?